And like magic, I am now standing before you and excited to be with you. When I started working for Anglicans for Life in 1998, our mission centered on ending abortion. I knew very little about abortion except from my own personal experience as a 16-year-old, having had one. And then, let's see, it was almost 19 years later that I finally attended an abortion aftercare healing program. And that allowed me to grieve and heal and receive God's unconditional love and forgiveness. So it took me a while after I came to work for Anglicans for Life, known back then as NOEL, the National Organization of Episcopalians for Life. It took me about 2 years to fully understand and comprehend the breadth and width of the abortion issue and the many subtopics that it included, like the different methods of abortion, who has them, where and when are abortions performed, and what about the hard cases like fetal anomaly or rape? I had to learn about how abortion impacts the mothers, which I understood, but the fathers and the family members and society at large. There was a lot to learn. Then I started learning about the sanctity of life, how God's word clearly states that life is sacred and must be honored, protected, respected, and celebrated. As I studied the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, I came to see that the sacredness of life is woven throughout the scriptures. I also had to learn about the other issues that Anglicans for Life addresses, especially adoption and abstinence, recognizing that we had to promote them as a means of preventing abortion. About a year into my tenure, I started hearing some other words that were not familiar to me. The first one was euthanasia. I would think, why are kids, euthanasia, being associated with this other strange phrase, physician-assisted suicide? Finally, one day when I was reading an article on assisted suicide, the definition of the word euthanasia came up and it clicked. We weren't talking about Asian children. We were talking about a form of hastening death, murder. When a doctor intentionally ends the life of a human being, typically an elderly or terminally ill or disabled person, most often using a lethal injection, that is euthanasia. I started digging into articles coming out of Oregon where physician-assisted suicide, its cousin, was being practiced after 2 voter referendums legalized it, and 2 Supreme Court cases were also involved in setting aside the law for a while. So it took a while for the law to actually be put into effect, if you will. It officially started, I believe, in 1998. But it was just overwhelming to me, and I couldn't believe that states were allowed to use narcotics to help somebody die intentionally. As I prayed about it and searched its genesis, I realized it sounded a lot like physician-assisted suicide, sounded a lot like somebody had invented a new form of abortion, but at the end of someone's life instead of at the beginning. I was appalled that a state in our country had decided it was acceptable and people had the right to prematurely end their life. This didn't make sense to me, as suicide is seen as a great injustice, depicting a desperate person lacking the ability to value their own life. Now we had state-sanctioned suicide? The definition of assisted suicide is when one person is directly and intentionally involved with helping end the life of another person. So physician-assisted suicide is when the person helping someone commit suicide is a doctor, usually involved by writing the prescription for the 100 pills that are required for the lethal dose. The patient is then responsible for taking the pills causing their own death. That is physician-assisted suicide, and it is now legal in 9 states. I should also note that a number of countries have legalized physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia or both. Canada, our neighbors and our brothers and sisters in the Anglican Communion, recently passed a law in 2016, and to help people with this new law, they coined a new term to address both the physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, while sanitizing the words to further validate the intentional killing of someone. They call it medical assistance in dying. The acronym is MAID, M-A-I-D. Kind of twisted. Now, some of you may be thinking about Jack Kevorkian, as he was the face of the assisted suicide movement back in the 80s and 90s, when he helped about 130 patients kill themselves. Dr. Kevorkian was convicted and went to jail for a few of the cases, ultimately one involving a patient for whom he removed several organs for research and donation. Many people were aghast when that happened because he justified hastening someone's death so their organs could help another person. Sadly, 20 years later, articles promoting organ harvesting as part of euthanasia are more commonplace and are indeed part of the pro-euthanasia agenda. The more I learned, the more concerned I became as I saw that the pro-death proponents were organized, well-financed, and aggressively introducing similar physician-assisted suicide legislation in states throughout our country. The purpose behind their efforts is to build support for it, and once public acceptance reaches a certain level, they plan to bring a case featuring somebody in a state where assisted suicide isn't legal to claim they must have the right to die too, as the people in Oregon can do it and other states. So the plan is to take the case to the Supreme Court with the hopes of legalizing assisted suicide nationwide. Similar, really, to the process of the cases of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton took to declare a woman had the right to abort their children. Promoters of physician-assisted suicide did two things really well. One, they adopted tactics that were used by abortion proponents by carefully managing the language. Our first clue here was the name change of the key agency working for legalization. The Hemlock Society is now known as Compassion and Choices, and physician-assisted suicide is now referred to as aid in dying. The media got involved producing movies like $1 Million Baby and multiple television shows that featured, these medical shows that feature people that wanted to die and how we had to feel so sad for them, all to cover and build support off of sympathy, using sympathy. And many of us may recall the multiple covers and articles that People magazine ran in 2014 that featured a beautiful young woman. She was, I think, 28, 29. Her name was Brittany Maynard. And she was forced to move to Oregon so she could end her life after being diagnosed with an aggressive brain cancer. The second thing the promoters of physician-assisted suicide did was to argue that the need for this method of dying was important and was needed because people do not want to live in pain, and they should have the right to end their pain by ending their life, especially people facing a terminal illness like end-stage cancer. Sadly, these promoters of assisted suicide ignore and undermine an important type of medical care referred to as palliative medical treatment, whose sole purpose is to alleviate and manage pain for patients. These proponents of death used people's fear of pain, I should say, as a scare tactic, a red herring to encourage people to seek physician-assisted suicide instead of medication to treat and manage their pain. Now, after over 20 years of physician-assisted suicide in Oregon alone, 2,518 people have died by it there. Interestingly, research into those deaths shows that they didn't choose physician-assisted suicide because of pain. Most people that hastened their death did so out of a fear of becoming a burden to their family, or losing their autonomy and independence, or because they were less able to engage in activities that made life enjoyable for them, or because they were lonely and believed nobody cared about them. We have also learned that when physician-assisted suicide is available, health insurance companies are less inclined to cover medications and treatments for various diagnoses like cancer, indirectly encouraging patients to seek physician-assisted suicide instead of medical care to treat the disease and manage the symptoms. We first learned this was happening when Barbara Wagner, a retired school bus driver who was insured under the Oregon Medicare plan, sought treatment when her cancer came back. Her doctor had recommended a new drug treatment, but the insurance company refused to cover it. They did suggest in the letter they sent her denying her medical claim that she could seek physician-assisted suicide as an alternative. That is the world that we are in now. Recognizing the problems associated with assisted suicide, Anglicans for Life created a fact card that also highlights 5 additional reasons we believe assisted suicide is wrong, including corrupting the patient-doctor relationship of trust, increasing suicide rates, opening the door to abuse, and turning freedom to die into a duty to die. Copies of this card are in your swag bag. I also want to mention that the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition predicts that assisted suicide bills will be introduced in at least 20 states, and some states that have already legalized assisted suicide will debate bills to expand their assisted suicide laws in 2021. The greatest concern is for assisted suicide bills passing in these states: Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Mexico, and New York. So, how did learning about physician-assisted suicide, the problems and misconceptions, lead to Anglicans for Life developing end-of-life ministry? By 2010, my concern about assisted suicide and how Anglicans for Life should be addressing it got more personal, as my parents were over 80 years old and living in California. My concern wasn't just how do we minister to people at the end of life, but now I began to appreciate that my parents may need help. I wondered what kind of health care would be offered or denied to them, as health care rationing had become a common discussion point after the Affordable Care Act, commonly known as Obamacare, had been passed. I also had no idea what my parents thought about death, as we had never talked about anything related to their dying. During a visit to my parents with my sister that year, I broached the topic of their death. I was afraid they would think I wanted them to die, but I knew that if I was going to encourage others about having these conversations, that I needed to do it also. I needed to appreciate what I was talking about. I'm happy to report that instead of my parents being angry or wondering what I was doing because I brought up this topic of their death, it actually became one of the most meaningful conversations we ever had. And it led to me creating this really big spreadsheet that captured all their pertinent financial and personal data, so that we, as their kids, would have basic information and know what to do if or when one of them died. I created the spreadsheet on my computer with my sister as my witness, and it included everything from their social security numbers to where they kept important documents. How much were their monthly expenses, income? What insurance policies, credit cards, IRAs did they own? It was during this discussion that we found out that they actually had a safe in their house, but we didn't even know that before. So we learned about the combination and we found out where it was. We also learned that they had already bought and paid for their funerals. And my mother had gone so far as to pick out the menu for the dinner she wanted served afterwards. The aging of my parents, combined with my growing knowledge of the physician-assisted suicide, led me to realize that the thief who would come to steal, kill, and destroy an unborn life was also lurking near those who were nearing the end of their life. And as much as we need to help mothers choose life for their unborn babies, We, the church, the pro-life community, family members, also need to help our elderly loved ones age well so they could die peacefully in God's time. I searched for resources that I could use to help my parents, as well as others, prepare for the end of life. I thought surely the church of all institutions should be equipped to help people age and die well. But there was nothing. So I realized Anglicans for Life needed to create the resources. Anglicans for Life had just released our first adult education program called Project Life, which is an 8-week DVD series that covered all the topics that we're trying to educate people about. So that became the model for our second adult education series on aging and dying that we titled Embrace the Journey. I spent more time researching the topics to include, and it took over a year to write it, as I had to learn much of what I was trying to teach. Writing about aging and dying as a 52-year-old with no experience of someone close to me dying made it hard for me to relate to some of the issues. I employed Billy Graham's book, Nearing Home, to help me appreciate life from the aging person's perspective. I finished on April 1st, 2013. It was my mother's 85th birthday, and I was so excited to go out and share with them what I had written and talk about the various topics I had learned about and what they thought about certain things like ventilators or feeding tubes in case something happened. Sadly, I never got the opportunity to share it with them because my mom had a massive stroke before I could get there. But everything I learned and wrote about helped me navigate the process of her death. I write in the introduction that after her death, I realized I was the first student, and writing Embrace the Journey, had prepared me for her death without realizing it at the time I was writing it. But God knew I would need that preparation. In Embrace the Journey, we seek to demystify topics like hospice, comfort care, futile care, and advanced directives like living wills, power of attorney, and a power of attorney for health care, physician orders for life-sustaining treatment. We address tough issues like brain death and organ donation, terminal sedation, and other methods to hasten death. But we also discuss practical aging issues like downsizing homes, surrendering driver's license, incontinence, funeral planning, and finally, we talk about suffering, grief, and the fear of death. Clearly, the fifth commandment to honor our parents on its own would justify the need for end-of-life ministry. But in addition to helping our parents prepare to age and die well, we need to recognize 3 other factors that impact how we think about end-of-life ministry in our culture. 1, we have an aging population here in America. In 1960, the average life expectancy was 72. Now it's 80 years old. Population studies indicate that the fastest growing demographic of people in the United States are the elderly. Currently, there are over 40 million people aged 65 and older, with the 2010 census reporting 5.5 million people age 85 years or older. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that by 2030, a mere 9 years away now, there will be 9 million people over the age of 85, an increase of almost 4 million people who are 85 years or older. Is the church prepared to help them? The second factor to impact the end-of-life ministry is the advances made in medical technology, medications, and preventative health care programs, which allow people to live relatively healthy lives for much longer. They get to stay active and are well engaged into their 80s or 90s. They feel good, and they're not consciously thinking about preparing for aging or dying until something catastrophic happens, like a bad fall, a terminal diagnosis of cancer, or an accident. The third factor to impact the need for end-of-life ministry is the reality that we are a very mobile society. which means that many of us live very far away from our parents, elderly siblings, or family members, and that creates a void when care and help become more necessary. Aging and dying are real, and it becomes even more real when illness, dementia, or the geriatric body starts to break down. We can all think of someone who was doing well and was very active, and then things changed rapidly. When two of our dear friends started missing church, I checked on them and found that both of them were struggling to handle day-to-day activities. Bills weren't getting paid. Wash wasn't being done. Meals weren't being prepared or eaten. This got my attention, and I realized I needed to start helping them more. Neither one of them had ever been married, so they had no children or family nearby. They had become like family to us, joining us for all of our holidays and our birthdays. So I started dropping in on them every day, taking meals, helping get groceries, doing wash. This led to us having some important conversations about how they envisioned getting old. I asked questions about their goals for their end of life, how they thought they would die, and yeah, it was awkward at times, but those talks led to the realization that they needed more permanent help. I ultimately became their power of attorney and now manage their care, which is done by 5 caregivers 24/7. They wanted to stay in their apartment and together, and they have been best friends for almost 70 years. What often strikes me when I'm with them is this question: if I hadn't stepped in, who would be handling their affairs now? They both have advanced memory loss and cannot stand or walk. The reality is they would have had their guardianship assigned by the court. Is this what we want for our friends, our loved ones, or even our crazy Uncle Bill? The church has a unique opportunity in this discussion, as we have the one thing the rest of the world lacks: victory over death. Our Lord and Savior conquered death through his resurrection. He invites us to share in that resurrected life eternally. The church has the death plan, but we're not talking about it. When was the last time you heard a sermon on death or dying? I believe society must stand against efforts to legalize physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, even when it's renamed medical aid in dying to make it sound like health care. We also need to prepare for the growing pastoral crisis as people face aging and dying. Will they come to the church for counsel about dying? And if they don't come to the church for counsel, where will they go? The Hemlock Society? This is why I believe we need end-of-life ministry in the church. We need to help families prepare so that when that stroke, that heart attack, or the diagnosis of Alzheimer's happens, it doesn't result in a battle between siblings or family members, but instead, proper prior preparations allow whatever time is left for the patient to be meaningful and seen as an opportunity to come together as a family. May our faithful living lead to us faithfully dying. I believe end-of-life ministry also presents a great opportunity for community outreach, as sharing the gospel with the elderly is basically a fresh field of harvesting. People 65 years and older are often open to rethinking priorities and are more ready to hear how the forgiveness of sins leads to everlasting life in heaven. They also feel very lonely and invisible, so engaging them can bear good fruit for God's kingdom. End-of-life ministry is about death, and while death can be an awkward topic, I have also come to see how death reminds us that life is sacred. Sadly, it is only when our loved ones die do we sometimes realize how much we took their presence, their love, their value for granted. As we have watched the number of deaths in this country grow due to COVID, I pray we as a society, we as a church, will realize how easy it is to ignore death until it knocks on your door. May we be inspired to embrace the opportunity to help our loved ones and our neighbors finish this journey well and only die when God calls them home. Let me close with this. Leviticus 19, chapter 19, verse 32 states, "Rise in the presence of the aged, show respect for the elderly, and revere your God. I am the Lord." In chapter 19 of Leviticus, what we see is the Lord is going over a bunch of the laws that he's already given them. He's repeating them. And they're the laws that were designed to guide the Israelites in living life according to God's plan for them. How fascinating to see that as the Lord ends the chapter, he finishes by calling on his people to show respect in standing in the presence of the elderly. This should give us all a clear indication of the value he places on the aged. I pray you will be inspired to do the same. Thank you. And now we will open this time up to question and answer, and will beam me back into the studio for the regular live session. Thank you.